tonight we're going to look at Ruth chapter 2 and verse 21 through chapter 3, verse 1. And that means we're going to finish Act 2, and we're just going to barely start Act 3, which I know all of you are wondering what's going on in Ruth chapter 3, verse 4. That's been on your mind since the very beginning of this study, and I'll answer that question next week, so you'll have to come back for that one. But a quick review, Act 1 was all about death and emptiness. It's a story of Elimelech and his wife Naomi and their two sons. They leave the land of Israel because there's a famine. They go to Moab because there's food there. But while they're in Moab, Elimelech dies, and then the two sons get married to Moabite women, and 10 years later, both of the sons die. That leaves Naomi with two Moabite daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth. And Naomi says to both of the young women, it would be better for you to stay in the land of Moab, go back to your father's house, and he'll help you find another husband for you. But for me, I'm going back to the land of Israel. I'm going back to my hometown, the town of Bethlehem, so why don't we just part ways? And Orpah says, that's a great idea. I'm going back home. And Ruth says to Naomi, I'm never leaving you. And she clings to Naomi and she doesn't leave. So she accompanies Naomi back to the land of Israel. And Naomi arrives back in Israel a very depressed, bitter woman. She blames God for all of her problems. She doesn't understand what's going on. She only knows that life has been terribly cruel to her, and now she's lost a husband and two sons, and the only person left in her life is a Moabite daughter-in-law. Well, the only good news in Act 1 is that barley harvest season is about to begin. And that brings us to Act 2, which is the search for short-term security. Naomi and Ruth are both widows. They have no one to provide for them and no one to protect them. So somehow they're going to have to figure this out on their own. And there are three scenes. In the first scene, it's a conversation between Naomi and Ruth Ruth comes up with a plan. And she says to Naomi, since we have no food, why don't I go out and glean in one of the fields? And just maybe I can find favor from someone who will let me do that. And at the end of the day, I can bring back some grain and we can make some food. And Naomi says, go ahead. In fact, she's so depressed, she doesn't do anything else, just go ahead. Well, the second scene is when Ruth and Boaz meet. And Boaz sees this unusual woman, this new woman in his field gleaning, and he wants to know who she is, and he finds out that this is Naomi's daughter-in-law. And Boaz has heard the story about what Ruth did for Naomi. And so Boaz decides he's going to return the kindness to Ruth. So he tells Ruth, you can glean in my field. In fact, follow right behind my female servants, and whatever they drop or miss, that's fair game for you to claim as your own. And in fact, he goes on to say later on to some of his servants, accidentally leave some stuff, so that Ruth goes home with a lot of grain at the end of the day. And sure enough, she does. She goes home that night with about 25 to 30 pounds of grain. And she goes back home, and the third scene is another conversation between Naomi and Ruth. And basically, Ruth tells Naomi everything that happened that day. And when Naomi sees all of this food, she's just doesn't know what to think. I mean, she's filled with hope and joy and excitement for the first time in a very long time. Her depression seems to tone itself down, and just maybe, there's a little bit of hope. And then she finds out that Ruth ended up in a field that belonged to Boaz. Oh, and that's even better news, because Boaz happens to be a relative. It's one of Elimelech's relatives, and maybe Boaz can help us. And then, all of a sudden, Naomi starts praising God and calling out for God to bless the man, Boaz, who had blessed Ruth. So, in that scene, we find Naomi healing physically, emotionally and spiritually. Physically, she started the day with no food. Now she has an abundance. Emotionally, she was absolutely depressed. Now there's a little bit of joy and a little bit of hope. Spiritually, she was mad at God and blamed God for all of her problems. But now she's asking God to bless the man who had blessed her. Healing is beginning to take place in the life of Naomi. In the last three verses, verses 21, 22, and 23 that we're going to look at tonight, there's kind of a recap of what Boaz did for Ruth. So it begins this way. Then Ruth the Moabite said, he, meaning Boaz, even said to me, stay with my workers until they finish harvesting all my grain. Well, Naomi's excitement causes Ruth to have her story interrupted. And Ruth goes back to telling Naomi everything that happened to her that day. And she's going to add some new information as she tells the story. Now, it's interesting that our author refers to Ruth as Ruth the Moabite. It's rather unusual at this point in the story. I mean, he's told us over and over again that Ruth is a Moabite. We know that by now. We don't need to be told that again. It's not new information. So why is she called Ruth the Moabite? Well, some suggest that there was more than one Ruth living in the town of Bethlehem. And in order to distinguish this Ruth from the other women in the town named Ruth, they simply called her Ruth the Moabite. And that might be the case. But it's unusual because of how Boaz has treated Ruth. Ruth understands when she goes out to glean that day that she's a foreigner. And she's just praying, hoping that somebody's going to be nice to her. She has no guarantee that anyone's going to. She understands that she's a foreigner. But Boaz, he accepts her. He tells her, you can glean in my field anytime you want. And not only that, I want you to follow in behind my female servants so you can glean the most you can possibly glean. And not only that, when it was time for the noon meal, Boaz invites Ruth to join him and his workers, and he presents Ruth with roasted grain. He has done everything possible to provide for her, to protect her, and to include her. So when Boaz looks at Ruth, he doesn't see a Moabite. He sees a woman who has been very kind to her mother-in-law, and he's going to be very kind to her. But by referring to her as Ruth the Moabite, it kind of goes back to the beginning of the story when Naomi shows up in Bethlehem. And she hasn't been there for at least 10 years, and people look at her and go, Naomi, is that you? And she says, yes. Well, who's that strange girl you have with you? In fact, she's not an Israelite. She's a Moabite. And then when Ruth goes out to glean, she understands that people may turn her down because she's not an Israelite. She's a Moabite. So maybe Boaz accepts her, but others in Bethlehem aren't so quick to accept this foreign young woman. It could be that when she's walking through town that people walk on the other side of the street or they avoid contact with her. Nobody talks to her. They're not really sure what to do with her. And it could even be that some of Boaz's servants, Boaz says to them, you've got to be nice to her. Don't harass her. Don't rebuke her. Be kind to her as I am being kind to her. And of course, the servants, they belong to Boaz, and they don't want to lose their meal ticket, so they're going to be kind to Ruth. But do they want to be kind to Ruth? I'm being kind, but inside, I don't want to accept this Moabite woman. If it was up to me, I'd have thrown her out of the field a long time ago. We're not sure. But out of respect for Boaz and fear of Boaz, they're going to be nice. So it's going to take more just to integrate Ruth into Israelite society. Now, as Ruth tells her story about what Boaz said to her, she says, "Stay with my workers." Now, the word workers is a masculine plural, which means it could refer to men, or it could refer to everybody. So in Hebrew, if you were referring to both men and women, you'd often use the masculine plural to mean all the servants. So maybe Ruth is saying, "Stay with all my servants." But that's not exactly what Boaz said to her. Boaz specifically said, "Stay with my female servants." But it could be, as Ruth is retelling the story, she's not giving all the details. Basically, Boaz said, "Stay with my servants and you're going to be okay." But specifically, he did say, "Stay with the female servants." In fact, Boaz, on more than one occasion, took his male servants aside and said, "Don't lay a hand on her. Don't do anything to her. Treat her with respect, and don't harass her in any way." So he actually had to say that to them because some of them may have been thinking in those terms, which kind of tells us a little bit about Israelite society at this time. They're not exactly following God's law. The law of Moses said you're supposed to let the foreigner glean in your field. So everyone should have been okay with it. But if you've ever read the book of Judges, the people of Israel are not following God at all. Now, when a good judge comes up, they follow God. Soon as the good judge dies, they quit following God. So Israelite society during the period of the Judges, they were not following God. They were not following the law of Moses. Ruth goes on to say that she can stay with the workers until they're done harvesting all the grain. Now, that's actually new information, that this privilege that she can stay with the workers until all the harvest is done is new. Boaz never said that in the previous scene, but apparently he did, and now Ruth is reporting this, that she's going to be able to glean until harvest season is over. And that would include both the barley harvest and the wheat harvest, and that would be about 7 weeks, from April until early June. And during those 7 weeks, she should be able to collect and store enough grain to feed her and Naomi for an entire year. So it's harvest season, and she's going to be taken care of. So by the time we get to the end of verse 21, we know that Naomi's physical issues have been resolved. She's not going to starve to death. She's going to have plenty of food. She's going to live. Emotionally, there's a little bit of pickup. And spiritually, she's a little bit more tuned into God as well. In fact, she says in verse 22 to Ruth, "It would be good for you, my daughter, to go with the women who work for him, because in someone else's field you might be harmed." And it's interesting that there are two things that basically Naomi says to Ruth. Number one, stay in the field that's owned by Boaz. So in other words, don't just wander off anywhere. You got to stay in the right field. And number two, stay with the women. And if you'll do that, you should be protected. And what's interesting is that Naomi is telling Ruth the same thing that Boaz told her back in chapter 2, verse 8. Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field. Don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me." Same instructions. Stay in the field. Stay with the women. You'll be protected. Things will go wonderful for you. And when we go back to verse 22, Naomi says, if you wander off, you could get harmed. And the word harmed literally means to be attacked. And she could be attacked verbally. I mean, Israelite women who are out there, or the men who are out in the field, "Oh, we have a Moabite with us. who let the Moabite into the field? And they could have told Moabite jokes. They could have been sarcastic to her. Emotionally, they could have just brought her to tears. But if she stays in the field and with the women, that's not going to happen. Also, they could harm her physically. Someone could harm her physically and tell her to never come back here again. And because Ruth is a single woman without a husband, she's a foreigner, she could be sexually assaulted as well. So she could be placed in harm's way if she wanders out of the field of Boaz. It's also interesting that Naomi tells Ruth those instructions after the fact. She should have said those very words to Ruth that morning, before Ruth went gleaning in the first place. You know, it's like reading a road sign that says danger ahead. You know, that's a warning. But if you read a road sign that says danger behind you, you're wondering, why tell me now? The warning comes after the fact. Why didn't Naomi say something earlier that morning? Perhaps she was so depressed she didn't even think about it. Perhaps she was so depressed she didn't even care. She was in pretty bad shape emotionally at that point. But now that she sees all this grain that Ruth has brought home, now that she has hope for the future, she knows she has to protect Ruth. Because Ruth is the one who will glean the food. It wasn't Naomi out there gleaning the food. It was Ruth. So Ruth has to be protected, and she is. Now, finally, in verse 23, the narrator is going to bring Act 2 to a close. And he says some rather important things in this summary. So Ruth stayed close to the women of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvest were finished. Ruth understands wisdom. When she hears wisdom, she follows it. Boaz told her what to do. Naomi tells her the exact same thing, and Ruth follows instructions. She stays with the women. It's interesting how the NIV translated this. She stayed close to the women of Boaz. It was actually the female servants of Boaz. In our culture, you hear the women of Boaz, you're thinking, his wives? Those were his women. Did he have many wives? Or did he have many girlfriends? So these were not women who Boaz was married to or attracted to. These were simply his servants. In fact, we find out in chapter 3, Boaz is not married at this time. So he doesn't really have any personal women in his lives, but he does have female servants who work for him. She stays throughout the harvest season, those 7 weeks, and she gathers all the food. And then finally, that last sentence, she lived with her mother-in-law. So Ruth, during the day, would be out in the field, gleaning. And when the sun begins to set, she comes home. She comes home to Naomi's home. And that's where she spends the evening and the night. That's her life. Now, she lives with her mother-in-law. That's a temporary solution. And it's better than nothing. It's better than living on your own, where you would not be protected. She at least has one family member, but it's not the ultimate solution. And it's interesting that just as the narrator did at the end of Act 1 in talking about the barley harvest, kind of set us up for Act 2, this last sentence sets us up for Act 3. Ruth is living with her mother-in-law. Even in our culture, who wants to live with their mother-in-law? Just a thought. But Ruth is living with her mother-in-law. Wouldn't it be better if Ruth was living with her husband. And that's what the writer wants us to think about. This is okay, but it could be better if she had a husband. And that leads us into Act 3. And Act 3 is the search for permanent security. So not just temporary security, they have that. They're not going to starve. They've got enough food to last the entire year. But for a widow in ancient times, that was okay, but it could get better. There could be something more permanent in the relationship. Now, we're not told how much time elapsed from Act 2 until Act 3, but they're still harvesting. They're still winnowing the grain. They're taking the grain to the threshing floor, getting rid of the chaff so that the grain remains. So we're talking days, we're talking weeks, we're certainly not talking months or years. So a short period of time. And Naomi must be thinking, Boaz is a relative. He's a really generous man. He has made sure that we're going to have enough food. We're not going to starve. We're going to be okay. We're going to survive. But as a relative, maybe he could do even more. He's from the same clan. He's from my husband's family. Elimelech and Boaz are related in some way. Maybe he could do even more for us. Well, the harvest season is beginning to wrap up. And during the harvest season, Ruth every day goes to his field. And chances are Boaz is there most days. And so she sees him most days. But once the harvest season's over, there's no reason for Ruth to go to the field. So the only way to see Boaz after harvest season is to kind of bump into him in town one day. In other words, the connection is about to be separated. So the time is short to try to convince Boaz to do more than just provide the food. And so, Naomi, overcoming her depression, comes up with a plan. She develops a plan for their permanent security. Well, the events in Act 3, interestingly enough, are going to take place from the evening of one day to the morning of the next day. We could call that a half day. Now, the events in chapter 2, Act 2, they took place in one day for the most part. The event in chapter 3, Act 3, is going to take place in a half day. So it's going to move rather quickly. There's going to be dialogue again. That's one of the great features about this entire book. We see the characters interacting with each other, having conversations with one another. In Act 2, there were 5 important conversations. In Act 3, there's going to be 3 important conversations that are going to take place. And in Act 3, the narrator's going to give us more background information that he did in Act 2. Now, all the acts, Act 1, 2, 3, and 4, all have 3 scenes. And the interesting thing is, the scenes in Act 3 are very similar to the scenes in Act 2. There are some key differences, but the scenes are very similar. Let me show you what I mean. This is Act 2. We just finished Act 2. 3 scenes. Scene 1, Naomi and Ruth have a conversation. Ruth comes up with a plan. Scene 2, Ruth and Boaz have a conversation. And it's a public encounter between Ruth and Boaz out in his field as she's gleaning. And then finally in scene 3, Naomi and Ruth have another conversation. It's an opportunity to debrief. Ruth goes out and does something. She comes home and informs her mother-in-law about what happens. Notice what happens in Act 3. Scene 1, Naomi and Ruth are having another conversation at Naomi's home. But notice this time Naomi comes up with a plan. It was Ruth's plan to go glean and get some food, provide some temporary security. But it's Naomi's plan to come up with some permanent security. So it's her plan this time. And then in the middle, again, is the encounter, the conversation between Ruth and Boaz. But this time it's not out in a field. It's at the threshing floor. It's time to take the grain and get rid of the chaff and keep the real grain. And Boaz is involved in that process. But now it's a more private encounter between Boaz and Ruth. And then finally in the last scene, Naomi and Ruth are going to talk again. And Ruth's going to tell Naomi everything that happened. And Naomi again is going to give her some additional instructions. So it's fascinating how these two acts are very similar, but different at the same time. So scene one is that Ruth is going to accept Naomi's plan. The scene is framed by two conversations. In verse 1, Naomi's going to talk. And she's going to talk all the way to the end of verse 4. And then in verse 5, Ruth gets to talk. Naomi comes up with the plan. Naomi dominates the conversation. Naomi initiates the conversation, and she speaks a whole lot longer than what Ruth does. Naomi in the Hebrew speaks 53 words. Ruth speaks 4 words. So this is truly Naomi's plan. And again, we can only speculate, but based upon what we already know if we read ahead, Naomi must be thinking, Boaz can do so much more. And maybe she was hoping every day when Ruth came home that Boaz may have winked at her, or Boaz may have said some things to her that made her believe that Boaz kind of liked her. Naomi's thinking that Boaz perhaps should develop more of a relationship with Ruth than simply a landowner and a foreign gleaner. She's been hoping, perhaps from day one, that somehow those two would get together. But the guy, as typical, doesn't get the hint. Doesn't seem to have a clue. Boaz is content to provide the food, protect Ruth, provide for her, try to include her, but that seems to be it from his perspective. So now it's up to Naomi to come up with a plan. She has to somehow come up with a plan to get the two together. And her speech that she gives to Ruth in chapter 3, verses 1 through 4, in verse 1, she'll state the problem. In verse 2, she'll give a summary of the facts. Then in verses 3 and 4, she's going to give detailed instructions to Ruth as to what she's going to do and what she wants Ruth to do. And those are the ones that raise all the questions for us. And we'll answer those questions hopefully next week. But it's a detailed procedure of what Ruth needs to do. And then finally in verse 5, Ruth's going to say, okay, I'll do what you want me to do. Now, personally, if I was Ruth, I would have asked a whole lot of questions before I said yes. But Ruth simply says yes, she's going to go along with the plan. Well, it all begins in verse 1. When the author writes, one day, Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, said to her, my daughter, I must find a home for you where you will be well provided for. It begins with one day, which doesn't tell us a whole lot about the time frame. You know, we know there's at least some time that has elapsed between Act 2 and Act 3, but we're not told how long. But since they're still harvesting and putting away the barley, it's got to be days or weeks. It can't be months or years. So it's a fairly short period of time between Act 2 and Act 3. Naomi's going to initiate this. She's called Ruth's mother-in-law, which means for the author, the focus is still on Ruth. Ruth is going to be the central character in chapter 3. But Naomi's going to play a very important part. And then Naomi turns to Ruth and says, my daughter. She could have said, my daughter-in-law. That would have been more appropriate. But perhaps Naomi's beginning to think, our relationship is more than just mother-in-law and daughter-in-law. Now it's like mother and daughter. Now, in the ancient world, if you were a young woman and you were unmarried, it would be your father's responsibility to find you a husband. And aren't we all glad that's not true today? I'm sure my girls are really happy that's not true today. I don't think they want me picking out their husband. But in the ancient world, that's how it worked. It would be the father's responsibility to find a husband for his daughter. The problem is, Ruth's father is back in Moab. And Ruth decided not to stay in Moab. Now, if she decided to stay, she would have gone back to her father's house, and her father would have tried to find her a husband. But now she's living in Israel. And the only relative she has in Israel is Naomi, her mother-in-law. So Naomi's thinking, I've got to do something. I have to be the one to find Ruth a husband. Now, Naomi has already decided she's too old to get married again. So she's not interested in finding another man. But for Ruth, she needs to find a husband. And since Ruth's father is back in Moab, it's now her responsibility to find her a husband. So, Naomi presents Ruth with a rhetorical question. At least it's a rhetorical question in Hebrew. The way the NIV translates it, it's a sentence, it's a statement. In the Hebrew, it would say, my daughter, should I not find a home for you? And the implied answer is, yes, I should. And because the implied answer is, yes, I should, the NIV translates it, my daughter, I must find a home for you. Meaning, if I don't find a home for you, there's no one else left to find a home for you. So I have to do this. Now, earlier, Naomi prayed for her daughters-in-law, Ruth and Orpah, after the sons had died. And I want us to notice her prayer back in chapter 1, verse 9. Naomi says, may the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband. So, Naomi's 2 boys have died. She now has 2 daughters-in-laws. And she says, I'm going to say a prayer for both of you, that God would help you find rest in the home of another husband. Now, in the ancient world, it was very important for a woman to have a husband. He provided for her. He also gave her security, rest, and a home. That's how it worked. In modern society, a young woman can live on her own, have a job, support herself, do all the things that she can do. But in ancient society, it did not work that way. So for a woman, it was very important to find a husband, which is why the father normally would be the one to do everything he could do to find her a husband. So Naomi knows these girls need a husband. And it's interesting that Ruth, at the end of chapter 2, was living where? With her mother-in-law. So for the moment, temporarily, she's finding rest and security in the home of her mother-in-law. But Naomi knows she needs to find rest and security in the home of a husband. Home with a husband would be better than home with a mother-in-law. And so Naomi knows, I've got to do something. Naomi has now turned a corner in her life. She's now accepting responsibility. Where at the beginning of chapter 2, she was in such a state that she could not accept responsibility. In fact, Naomi comes back to Bethlehem and says, "Don't call me Naomi," which means pleasant. Call me Mara, which means bitter. So Naomi saw herself as a bitter old woman in chapter 1. But once she sees the grain, she begins to think, God may not be done with me after all. You know, the God that I'm mad at, the God I blame for all my problems, may show me favor after all. And there was that turning point in her life. And whenever we have a problem, especially one that impacts us physically, emotionally, and spiritually, we look for that turning point. That point where we go, wait a second, maybe there's hope. You know, if you're got a physical problem, and it looks like, this physical problem's overwhelmed me, and then one day you begin to feel a little bit better, and you're going, maybe I can beat this thing. Maybe I can overcome this thing. Maybe I'm going to get better. You know, if you're drowning in debt, you know, all of a sudden, okay, my financial situation looks a little better. Maybe I can get out of this hole that I'm in. Or maybe a relationship that's just turned sour, and all of a sudden, maybe there's hope. You know, the person reaches out. They send you a text, and you go, okay, maybe this relationship's not going to fall completely apart. Maybe it can be restored. So whatever the problem may happen to be, there's that turning point when you have a little hope that maybe it can be restored. And now that Naomi has had a turning point, when she sees the grain, when she understands that Boaz is the one who provided all of this, now she's beginning to think. Now she's beginning to be creative. She's thinking about a solution. You know, when you're depressed, you can't think of a solution. I mean, you know, you're not open to a solution. But once you have that turning point, now you can start thinking about a solution. You know, maybe there's a way out of this problem. Maybe there's something we can do. And Naomi reaches the point where she says, you know what? I've got a plan. And when we have a problem, we should pray and ask God for a plan to get out of the problem. Because God knows the way out. And He's willing to let us know what we need to do. Naomi has reached the point where she has a plan. And she's saying, you know, Ruth, you need to find a home, a real home, with a husband, where you can be well provided for. You can move in with your husband and have a family and have a home. Because for a woman in the ancient world, the number one thing she could do to build her self-esteem is give birth to a male son. I mean, if she gives her husband an heir, she's fulfilled her purpose in the ancient world. And Ruth, you can do that if you get married. And your husband will provide for you. You know, you won't have to go out and glean anymore. He can work. You can stay home. Take care of the house. Take care of the kids. That's the way they did it in the ancient world. You can be well provided for. In many ways, in the ancient world, to be a widow, especially a young widow, was almost like a curse or a reproach. You know, it's like, what did you do that God let that happen? So if she gets married again, the reproach will be gone. She can have somebody to take care of her. And life can be good again. And maybe Naomi can have a grandchild. Maybe what she's thinking too. Well, next week we'll continue on and we'll find out what Naomi's plan is. And we already told you Ruth said yes, but we'll find out what Ruth is going to have to be up to once she hears what this plan actually is. But tonight, when we have a problem, we can get so consumed by that problem that it overwhelms us to the point where we can't even think about a solution. And we should pray for a breakthrough, a turning point, where we can start thinking about a solution, where God can give us a solution. You know, I heard one time from somebody that, when you're married, you should never bring up the word divorce. Because if you don't bring it up, it's not an option. And so if you're having problems, your brain would automatically think, well, if I just divorce her, I can get rid of my problems. But if divorce is not an option, that means you have to come up with a different option. And you have to ask your brain to come up with an answer that doesn't involve divorce. And your brain is your friend, by the way. Whatever you ask it, it'll come up with something. God put it there for a reason. And Naomi's brain is now thinking about solutions. She's not thinking about problems anymore. So, when we get into a problem, we need to reach that point too. We say, okay, this is not, these things I'm not going to do, but I have to come up with a solution. And I need to be creative. And I need to pray and ask God for a solution. Well, let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for this story. It's a fascinating story. And it's a story that gets replicated over and over again in our lives because we have problems too. It may not be the same problem, but we have problems and we need solutions. And sometimes we just get so caught up in the problem that we don't even think about a solution. Father, help us to get out of that state and get into a state where we're open to you, open to listening to what your solutions might be for our problems. So, Father, I pray that you will bring us to a point where there's a turning point, where we're no longer letting the problem run our life, but instead we're going to be focused on solving that problem and seeking your answers to what you want us to do. So, Father, I pray your blessings on all of us, no matter what we're going through. May we turn to you and see you do great things in our lives. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen.